bones is stronger. The people fight is stronger.
War and Taxes is presented in 4 parts. Part 1 looks at the impact that the economic crisis is having on working people. Part 2 examines the impact of war and military spending. Part 3 presents an alternative budget for all developed by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And Part 4 introduces the Campaign for New Priorities, which organizes to support the progressive alternative. Finally, the presentation closes with a short excerpt from a powerful speech by Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. Each segment can be viewed separately from the rest. We all know, and if we don't, we're told this repeatedly from childhood on, that America is the greatest. We're number one. Our top corporate executives earn more than any others in the world, almost 350 times the earnings of the average worker. 40 years ago, their earnings were just 42 times greater. The top 1% now receive 24% of the nation's income. This chart ends in 2007. Actually, in 2011, that thin slice of the workforce hit income levels not seen since before the Great Depression of the 1930s. From 1973 on, the share of income received by the top 1% had short periods of decline, but the trend is clear. They're on a stairway to heaven. How did the rest of us fare? Over the course of 28 years between 1979 and 2007, the top 1% enjoyed income gains that averaged almost 10% per year, while the gains for the bottom 80% averaged just over 1% per year. In 2010, the richest 1% captured 93% of the income gains. This chart tells a painful story. From 1973 on, the majority of workers saw their incomes, adjusted for inflation, drop precipitously, with short periods of income growth followed by still steeper declines. Ours isn't a stairway. It's a slide towards poverty wages. To make up for this, we worked more hours, sent more of our family into the workforce, took on second and third jobs, used our homes as piggy banks, borrowing against their equity in a desperate effort to maintain our standard of living. Let's take a closer look at how the 1% made out. Here we see the record of income shares by 3 different segments of the top 10% of income earners between 1913 and 2010. The black line is the record of the top 1%, the blue line for the next 4%, and the red line for the final 5%. Together, this is the income share of the top 10% of the workforce. The right-hand third of the chart is the period from 1973 on. There's a lot of volatility in the incomes of the 1% because so much of their income is tied to the stock market. The dips are periods of recession when stock values tend to decline. But here again, the trend is clear. Those at the top got larger and larger shares of the national income. While those at the top enjoyed sharply rising incomes, the average family saw its income drop by more than $3,700 in the decade of wars and recession. Unlike those at the top, their incomes never recovered. Income alone, however, is only part of the story. In order to see how people are doing, you need to also look at their wealth, the accumulation of savings, assets, and property they own after paying their expenses. As of 2007, the bottom 80% of the population held 7% of the wealth. The top 1% had 42% of the wealth, and together the top 10% held a whopping 80% of the wealth. If you didn't know the painful truth, you couldn't be faulted for thinking this must describe a monarchy, not a democracy. But the golden rule prevails. Those who have the gold make the rules. That's what Citizens United is all about. Dollars equals speech. The more wealth you have, the more speech you can afford. The U.S. has the fifth most unequal distribution of wealth in the entire world. The richest of the rich in the U.S. have incomes that are many times the incomes of the rich in other industrialized countries. The 400 richest families in the U.S. have more wealth than the bottom 150 million combined. Since 1979, the average income of the top 1% increased by $700,000, while the average income of the bottom 90% actually decreased by $900. While we're closing daycare and elder care centers and fire stations, we're still building more prisons. The U.S. pays to maintain an arsenal of 5,000 nuclear weapons we say we don't intend to use, while 50 million Americans have no health care coverage at all, and for most people who have it, losing their job means losing their health benefits. We spend more on health care than any other industrialized country in the world. Compared to other developed industrialized countries, we can proudly claim that a greater share of our children live in poverty. 43.6 million Americans live in poverty in the richest country in the world. We take the prize again for the portion of our population that is homeless. Almost 1 in 12 Americans experienced homelessness at some time between 1990 and 2006. Since the 1960s, while average incomes declined and those at the top flourished, the cost of maintaining our government and public services has shifted steadily onto the backs of already beleaguered individual taxpayers, while the share of taxes paid by corporations steadily declined. 32 corporations spent more on compensation for top executives in 2010 than they paid in income taxes. In the last 3 years, 30 of America's largest corporations, like GE and Exxon, paid no taxes at all. In those 3 years, Wells Fargo received over $680 million in tax rebates, and together, these 30 major corporations received over $10 billion in tax rebates, what you and I know as tax refunds. Corporate tax revenues are at historic lows. The highest income Americans have seen their tax rates fall as their incomes have skyrocketed. In 2007, the effective income tax for the richest 400 Americans was below 17%. And in 2010, Mitt Romney paid just 13.9% of his $21.6 million income in taxes, the same tax rate as someone who earned a mere $8,500 to $34,500. The 1% has been so successful in getting Congress to insert loopholes into the tax code that with an army of tax lawyers and accountants, oil companies scored $4 billion in tax breaks, while at the same time earning record profits. And 1,470 households, earning more than $1 million a year, managed to pay not a single penny in taxes. On average, Bush-era tax cuts for the top 1% are worth more than what the average family makes all year.